Okay, so welcome again to the Jackson Hole China Forum. This is our last week of this quarter. For those students who come to the event, it's very grateful. Guys, come here. Wow. Okay. and the weather is not that great. So that's a problem for our speaker. He brought from Southern California. I'm so delighted. Today we have a speaker from University of Southern California, Professor Stanley Rosen, who I have known how many years, I don't remember. Yeah, I was graduate student, yes. When I was a PhD student in San Diego, running him in a hallway. Where this person came from, speaking so good Chinese. He's from China, he speaks really better Chinese than I do. And he's a professor of political science, but he does much more than normal Euro political science. He do Chinese movies, and also Chinese society and almost everything you can think of China. He has research on those subjects. It's really amazing for me. He brought all those Chinese big directors of movies to LA. I think that's a place people want to be for making movies. And just get those people to those places. Needs a lot of money. I don't know where he got those money to invite those people. But he has been doing really well. He's a good friend for 20 years. I'm so delighted that Professor Rosen is here talking about real Chinese. Please stand up. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, well, that's great. Thank you for that nice introduction. It is a strange, somebody already asked me beforehand, what do you mean by the real China? Please, actually, now that I thought about it, it goes back to an old show I used to watch on TV called I've Got a Secret or something, and they had a panel, and three people would be on the stage, and they'd all pretend to be someone. Only one was really the person they pretended to be. To tell the truth, that's what it is. Tell the truth, yeah. John Daly, to tell the truth. With a real so-and-so, please stand up. But the reason I'm doing it here is because it's part of my argument that China's trying to do many things at the same time, and they tend to be sometimes contradictory, as I'll show you in some slides later on. I'm not going to get through all my slides. I have 156 PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to get through all of them. I'm not going to try to. But you'll see a couple later on where I look at the CCP as the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Confucian Party, the Chinese Capitalist Party. They're doing all these things at the same time, and they sometimes don't really mesh very well together. In the same way that, as I've written about in the past, youth attitudes, behavior, and so on, value systems encompass material values, because the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government basically has staked its legitimacy not on ideology, but on improving the standard of living, creating a middle class, more and more people in the middle class. Also bringing the best of international culture to China. So internationalism, imperialism, as well as patriotism or nationalism. All these things are going on at the same time. And again, they can be contradictory. So you can say almost anything about China, and it's going to be true or false at some place in China. So that's part of the reason for that. I'm going to start off, and it's something I've just added in the last few days, two kind of recent cases that have been in the news. I'm going to start off with that, I think. The first one is Jeremy Lin, or what is known as Linsanity, because here you have China and Taiwan competing for claims to Jeremy Lin. Someone born in California, doesn't speak Mandarin well, but China and Taiwan both see themselves in this new basketball star for the New York Knicks. In fact, if you look at some of the Weibo, some of the microblogs in China, some people are suggesting if only he could play for the Chinese national team, he could do much better. But the irony, in a sense, is that someone like a Jeremy Lin would probably never have made it if he had grown up in China, because he does. he's not like a Yao Ming or some of the other really tall players, and the system in China chooses people, the sports system, very early on, and Jeremy Lin might well have been passed over. He's also evangelical Christian, which is complicated. So if you look at some of the claims that are being made for him, they basically talk about his ancestral home in Jiaxing, near Hangzhou, and in fact, his maternal grandmother and other family members have been giving thousands of dollars a year to the Jiaxing High School. So that a claim is being made, but there's some embarrassment because he's from really Taiwan. He identifies really as a Chinese American from Taiwan. His parents from Taiwan. Taiwan press has covered it very extensively, of course. His games are not broadcast yet on Chinese Central Television, partly for time differences, also because it's a little difficult. So, for example, in Beijing TV, where they have broadcast again, you have a lot of people in the stands holding up Taiwan flags, which have to be blocked out if it's shown on TV. Also, just one other example, when they have shown his meeting with Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan, a video from 2010, if you look at the background, there was a kind of a digital blur-out which almost encompassed Jeremy Lin himself because they had that Republic of China flag which had to be blocked out. So it's very awkward. You can claim him, but you don't want to claim him completely because the complete person includes someone from Taiwan, or identifies with Taiwan, evangelical Christian, and so on. And you have all these cartoons now coming out about Jeremy Lin is the new hero, Xin Yingshou, the new hero. If you look at Baidu, Lin Shuhao, they emphasize the fact where he was born, again, he doesn't necessarily identify very much with that past. Also, another thing that's interesting in that case is the issue of trademarks, because again, this is a feature of China. Michael Jordan's had the problem, the iPad has the problem, in that you can register trademarks in China very cheaply, very easily, and Chinese law favors those who register trademarks first. So Apple, as well as Michael Jordan, because of the Chaodan registration, have had some difficulties. Here's a trademark. Someone in the sporting goods business in Wuxi registered the trademark Jeremy SHL, Shu Hao Lin, in China last year when he entered the NBA. This guy saw a great opportunity and took it. It was only $700 to register that trademark. So now that Nike and Adidas are both trying to market Jeremy Lin goods in China, the question is what's going to happen in court with these trademarks. So again, it's part of China being part of a transnational, international system. You know somebody has made it when there are rumors that Kim Kardashian is dating them. So Jeremy Lin has had to deny that he's dating Kim Kardashian. That's a sign that somebody's become very popular in the sports world. The second case, which I won't spend as much time on, is Wang Lijun, the vice mayor of Chongqing, who's been in the news lately. How many people follow that story? Okay, not too many people, but he's just been declared as of yesterday a traitor because he apparently sought asylum at the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, in Sichuan province, but he was Wo Xinlai's right-hand man in Chongqing. The reason I'm putting this up there, again, is to show this kind of internationalization where China, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party can no longer control the information. So when Wang Lijun went to the U.S. consulate, all sorts of screenshots were shown of all these vehicles from Sichuan public security and so on following him, and it became a big topic on the microblogs in China. So the information revolution is very important in getting messages out, even to the point, you can't see it very well, but somebody posted electronic ticket of his flight to Beijing, Wang Lijun, with Chou Jin from the Ministry of State Security. So everything gets on the internet now, no matter how much you may try to hide it. You can't really tell often the difference between the rumors and what's actually true, partly because in the attempt to control information and to manage the news, the Chinese government leaves themselves open to all sorts of other interpretations, since there's a lot of suspicion that they're not giving the true story. So the Weibo's and the microblogs have become very important as sources of information.
Is there any question that something like that actual screen, though, is valid, that actually was the flight ticket? Doesn't lead to that.
What do you think?
I think they found from online. They just put their name.
Yeah.
They got find their identification number, put in, then came out. These are true.
Yeah, okay. So the document itself is probably, okay.
Seems like it.
Seems like, it seems like probably the best.
Yeah, but with Photoshop and everything else these days.
True.
Yeah, true. And there are all sorts of things. Washington, for example, supposedly has a Wang Lijun's letter to the world on Julie Bush. So whether it's true or not, because all of this stuff is out there circulating. It's very hard to separate fact from fiction. And then, of course, the Western press on Wang Lijun. Okay, that was just kind of an introduction and some of the recent developments. Let me start more formally to talk about the rise of China and my larger theme about all the different things going on. As of the end of December 2017, before that, it was very clear. You look at Newsweek, very symbolic. China now, Yao Ming, towering over Newsweek. What's next? The new superpower steps up. This is before the Olympics of August 2008. Then you have all these cartoons. Many of these kinds of cartoons showing the decline of the United States and the rise of China. Gilbert, which is one of my favorite cartoons, where does your company fit on this comprehensive list? Facebook, China, irrelevant. So if you're not in China, you're not on Facebook. These are CEOs and managers of corporations, for people from the business school. If you're not on Facebook, you're not in China, then you might as well not be in business. That's the message. Some couple of other examples. Hu Jintao State Dinner from China, catered by McDonald's. So, I mean, this is the popular culture becomes very important because these are the perceptions of China, the rise of China. In fact, Martin Wolf, the writer for the Financial Times, his article last year, it wasn't whether China should rule the world, but how China should rule the world. In other words, it's kind of already an assumption, fait accompli, that China is going to be ruling the world. On the other hand, you have the other side of it, Time Magazine, talking about counting on China's growth to save the world unless its economy blows up first. You can see that in the stock market in the last few days. After Wen Jiabao and National People's Congress report about the growth rate in China dropping to 7.5%, all of a sudden the stock markets began. That and the Greek financial crisis are the two big things driving the market. A drop in Chinese economic growth will have a major effect on the rest of the world. It's part of this larger transnational issue. Another indicator of the rise of China, The Economist has a new weekly section on China. The first country to get this kind of special section since 1942 in the United States. Another good indicator. And of course, The Economist, in talking about what's going to happen in 2012, talks about all of the possible problems, protests that are occurring in China and the importance of social media. Foreign Affairs last year had a series of articles, Will China's Rise Lead to War, and Does China Have a Grand Strategy? If I had more time, I would talk about it in some detail. But Tom Christensen, who's at Princeton, who used to work in the U.S. government for a couple of years, in his article, he talks about serious domestic political insecurity, the sensitivity to nationalist criticism may make China much more, in a sense, compelled to respond to the United States in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Various challenges abroad. Wang Jisi from Beijing University, head of the Institute of International Studies there, and China's leading America watcher, and advisor to Hu Jintao and other leaders, also is very concerned about the success of nationalism, public frustration, pressure on the government, very concerned about all these different plural voices now saying what China's core interests actually are. Books by Peter Gries and Susan Shirk make the argument that China, and this is part of what is the real China, what is really going on in China, part of that original title I gave. Their argument is that, as Susan Shirk in her book called his advisor, when he was in graduate school, so he can't say anything negative about it, I guess, but anything at all. Susan Shirk's book, China, Fragile Superpower, makes the argument that the government is losing control over information, military capabilities are improving, there's more and more pressure to defend China's honor by using force. And Pete Gries as well, in his book, China's New Nationalism, makes that kind of argument that we have a very fragile state with a very increasingly strong society and a rise of public opinion. James Riley, in his new book that just came out, I reviewed this for the publisher, Columbia, so I'm very familiar with the argument. He's very critical of this argument by Gries and Shirk, and talks about how popular nationalism, market forces, information technology really hasn't hurt the Chinese state. They're much more robust, much more flexible in adapting to these new conditions. And yet, in his book, he has 4 case studies on Japan policy, showing how the Chinese government has manipulated, in a sense, public opinion to their benefit. So, again, this is part of the debate on what is going on in China, what is the relationship between the state and society. Now, one of the areas I work on is state-society relations. There were times I could talk about public opinion on foreign policy issues, and the most important thing is elite unity. As the Chinese leadership found out in 1989 in student demonstrations and at various other times, if the leadership is not unified, you're going to have problems from society. If there is elite unity, the problems are much less likely to occur, which is probably why Bo Xilai in Chongqing is likely not to be punished in any kind of open way over what's happening there. So one of the key questions is how fragile is the state? Elite unity issues, under what circumstances might that break down? I can talk about much more of this, but since I have so many slides, I'm hesitating to get into this in too much detail, except to say that continuing legitimacy clearly depends on performance. And as I said earlier, these can be inherently contradictory. So you want to promote material values, internationalist values. You want to promote the rise of the middle class, more and more people entering the middle class. You want to promote Chinese soft power. You want to promote world-class institutions, world-class culture, transforming China into a world power on the world stage. All these different elements affect both foreign policy as well as domestic policy. And some of this I'll be talking about as we go on. I mentioned this at the beginning, that you have the Chinese Communist Party, the old CCP. You have Mao still in Tiananmen Square. His portrait is still there. The legacy of the socialist era is still there. One of the reasons you have so many mass incidents with so much social unrest is people do feel a certain sense of entitlement, since they are a socialist country and they've had a socialist legacy before the reform period began, and even during the early stages of the reform period. So that old Maoist legacy is still there, which is why Bo Xilai and Chongqing could promote singing red songs, for example, and looking back to some of the positive aspects of the Mao period. And there's a certain nostalgia for that period because even though people may have been poor, there was much less corruption. So with the corruption going on now, people look back at it as in some ways, mythical golden era. But CCP also The Chinese have Confucius institutes all over the world. They're promoting these Confucian values because they're good for development, hard work, education. So CCP, some people say, is really the Chinese Confucian Party, not really communist anymore. So you have the statue of Confucius appearing in Tiananmen Square in 2011, beginning in 2011, and people say, wow, that's interesting, Mao here and Confucius there, what is the relationship between the two? That became very confusing. So by April, Confucius was removed in power struggle with Mao. And the explanations were not very convincing. One of the explanations was he never should have been in the first place. Well, something doesn't show up in Tiananmen Square, well, that's a pretty high level of approval. And then he's moved into a back garden, hard to see. But then you have, as the Economist has in his cover story, that with capitalism, entrepreneurial China, private entrepreneurs, you have the CCP standing for the Chinese Capitalist Party, all at the same time. All CCP, all of these things are going on at the same time. Having traveled to China maybe 45 or more times over the last 30 plus years, I've seen various periods where people are not happy. Right before 1989, student demonstrations, when I was there in 88, 89, I saw a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of unhappiness now. Here's a book called China's Unhappy. These are the people who wrote this book. Some of them I know and I've interviewed when they wrote the book, China Can Say No. Now, this China's Unhappy. They're trying to push China in a more I guess, leftist direction and nationalist direction, stand up to the United States, stand up to Japan. The argument they make, among other things, if you talk to them or read their interviews, is that back when we wrote China Can Say No in 1996, China was relatively weak. Now we're much stronger. Why are we still basically not standing up to our adversaries? Why aren't we pushing our advantage? But when you talk to them privately, some of them, it's very clear that their criticism is much more of the Chinese government than the West. They expect the West to pursue their own interests. They expect Japan to pursue its own interests. What they're upset about is all the corruption in China, how the children of the leaders are making all this money in business, and so on, the so-called princelings, the Taizinan, the children of high-level cadres. So they can't say that openly, but that's really, in some ways, part of their agenda. That the so-called reformist leadership is actually hurting China, whereas we need a much more radical leadership, both domestically and internationally. So that's one current. This was a bestseller. And if you look at surveys, here's one. Why are people unhappy? Corruption is number one. Increasing income gap. This was done in December 2009. I think this issue of pollution, ecological damage, is becoming more and more prominent now. But there are a lot of obvious reasons why people would be unhappy in China, which is why the government is so concerned about these mass incidents, over 100,000 a year. This is another issue that comes up, the morality issue, the loss of collective morality. This was a study that originally was done by Reader's Digest in the United States, and then was duplicated all over the world, where you took a wallet with $50 in local currency and you put it in a public place with information on how to return the wallet. And then you found out what percentage of people actually returned the wallet. In Scandinavia, it was 100%. Mexico was at the bottom. But in China, I've got to figure out how to use my own clicker. China was second from the bottom, only 30%. So that created some concern. This was in December 2001, came out in the Shanghai Journal Society. More recently, you have the case of Wang Yue, who was hit by a van in Foshan, in Guangdong province, and lay on the road with nobody coming by to pick her up, and she eventually died in the hospital. Another example of the lack of public concern. But part of the problem in this case, And some people say, and they tell me, Chinese friends, why you don't do it? Well, for one thing, the laws have not really caught up. I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about private planes if I have time in China. But if you hit somebody and you injure them, first of all, if you take them to the hospital, often you're expected to pay the bills because there's a real suspicion that you did it. Why would you take them to the hospital unless you had actually felt guilty because you hit them? Also, if you hit them, you may be liable for damages for many, many years to pay for their health care. On the other hand, if you hit them and they die, then you have to just pay compensation. So there are cases that have occurred where somebody's been hit on the road where the drivers run over them several times to make sure they're actually dead. Because political scientists like me look at rational choice theory. And rational choice indicates that better off killing somebody. So there's a real concern in China. It's debated on the Chinese microblog.
By the way, let me add one example.
Yeah.
Last week they have a war in Nanjing City. They have put money there. Whoever bring an old person to the hospital by hit by other people, they receive money from that patient.
That's more. That's following rational choice theory. That's good. That makes sense. And so you have some of the articles. Like this cover story, why can't we trust each other in China Weekly? This is going back to 2002 when conspicuous consumption was very prominent. So this guy, Li Qingfu, outside Shanghai, he built his corporate headquarters, looked like the Capitol building, with a statue of himself on top to make sure it was bigger than any Mao statue. That's changed because the Chinese government was very wise that anybody on the top 10 list of the richest people in China, in Forbes magazine, they arrested for tax evasion. So now people are basically trying to play down very well. But there is this so-called Hunyebing, red eye disease, the tofu, hatred against the rich. And books are appearing in China precisely on that problem. The argument being that anybody who's that wealthy could not have done it through legitimate means. I look at sometimes some internal or Neibun journals, like Lingdao Changyue, which is reference material for leaders, and they have surveys and articles on who are these super rich people, who are these top people, and how do they get their money, and so on. Then you have people like Sun Liping, a leading sociologist at Tsinghua University, who writes on this. And this book, for example, on cleavage, or fracture, is about how China is living in five different technological eras at the same time. That the gap between rich and poor is becoming, the Gini coefficient of inequality is becoming worse and worse in China. So the last NPC last year, Premier Wen Jiabao, his basic slogan was no longer economic growth, but make people happy. Local cadres, local officials have to make people happy. Easier said than done. And then you have cases like Barry Locke, when he became the new ambassador from the United States to China. He was photographed by a Chinese citizen who saw him carrying his own backpack with his daughter ordering his own coffee at an airport. And it was posted again, the role of social media, it was posted in China. And people were saying, wow, we could never find any officials in China who would do that. There's always an army of people to help them out. The simple life. And so there's a lot of reporting on that. You have 40,000 reposts, thousands of comments. It's something unbelievable in China, even for low-ranking officials who don't do things for ourselves. Somebody would go to buy their coffee, somebody carried their bags, and have private cars. So that so-called simplicity. On the other hand, the Global Times, a nationalist paper, basically said, all this attention Locke is receiving is far more than he deserves. And in fact, they make the argument, which actually makes some sense. When Joe Biden went to China, Vice President Biden, he insisted on going to a street restaurant in Beijing to have noodles with the local people. And as the Global Times pointed out, that for Biden to do that, it costs a lot more money with security and everything else than if he just goes to the state guest house and has a regular meal like he should. So in fact, it's counterproductive, and it's just a political show. But again, that's the kind of thing that attracts attention. In terms of China's soft power, you had, when Hu Jintao visited in January 2011, you had a billboard in Times Square where you had recurring pictures of China's sports stars like Yao Ming, China's supermodels, China's entrepreneurs. It was meant to show the Americans in New York were just like you. So it was intended to be a very positive message, but when you have this towering thing in Times Square, it almost makes it look like China has arrived. It's much more threatening. So the message being sent is not always the message being received. And again, part of the contradiction of trying to be world class in everything, at the same time being concerned about inequalities, is you have things like, this is Wangfujing, the main shopping street in Beijing, where the government last year began to fine or threaten to fine companies that in their advertisements use words like luxury, supreme, high class, royal, because that gives the impression that somehow only people with a lot of money can buy these things. But if you go to Beijing, you see Ferrari dealerships, Lamborghini dealerships, and so on all over the place. So there is that possibility for wealthy people to engage in that kind of conspicuous consumption. At the same time, there's the concern that we have to show that we realize that we have to look out kind of for the poorer people. It's almost like Mitt Romney running, I don't want to make a political statement about the U.S., when Mitt Romney tries to explain, or his wife says, we're really not that wealthy, we can lose everything tomorrow. Or when Mitt Romney says, we're big supporters of General Motors here in Michigan. My wife drives a couple of Cadillacs. And sometimes what you say, and sometimes you have the same problem. Sometimes what you say without thinking, what you think is a good thing, turns out to be a different message when it's received. Private planes. I'd say a lot about private planes. Again, it's also showing the wealth. China has the second largest number of billionaires in the world, second to the U.S. When private planes were licensed for the first time, more than half the people who fly private planes never registered their planes, which could be dangerous. The reason, again, has to do with the legal system not catching up to social change, because it costs more to register your plane than the fine you pay for flying an unregistered plane. So again, rational choice is an unregistered plane. So again, the legal system will catch up eventually, but it's a new thing in China, so they didn't think about the cost. Middle class, I can say a lot about the middle class. This is, again, an image of someone overweight playing golf. This is what the middle class looks like. And this is a survey on who are the richest people in China, how they got their money. A lot of surveys on middle class. I'm using this one as the most authoritative national survey at the time, where it looked at profession, income, consumption, lifestyle, ownership of commodities, subjective. Now, subjective identification is very important. It's almost 47%, because if you think you're a member of the middle class, even if you're not, that means you support the government more. It shows that you're doing the right thing, rather than having a lower percentage there. In that survey, it was about 35 million people, but I have a slide in Chinese which has 7 or 8 different surveys on middle class. The numbers vary widely as to how many people are actually in the middle class and how you really define middle class. In this study that published in Zhongguoqing Bao, China Youth Daily, when they asked people if they're in middle class, over 80% said they were not in the middle class now, but over 43% expected in the next 10 years a very good possibility they would be in the middle class. So again, it's optimism for the future, which is good for the government. I get to talk about popular culture. How many people know who this is? Anybody? Well, you would know because you're a professor working on these issues. The
Chinese scholars from China, they should know.
They should know. Yeah, they definitely should know. Chinese Supergirl, I can say a lot with the Chinese version of American Idol. Say a lot about that too if there were time. Internationally, I don't think Koreans here, but Boa is very popular. But the Korean Wave, the Hangul Korean Wave. Another example, internationalization. Another example, Used to be the most popular English expression in China was "Oh my God." Now it's called "My Lady Gaga." Maybe it's changed again from. Big Bang Theory is very popular in China. In fact, all of the American comedies and dramas easily available for purchase in the Daobao or pirated DVDs in China. If anybody's interested, I can give you the names of people to call for that. This is a book that I have, tells you how to be cool. A lot of that kind of stuff around. Orange County, that's more for my audience in Los Angeles. But they have all these gated housing, gated communities where you can separate yourself from the masses, just like the emperors did, or the Chinese leadership did in Zhongnanhai. These gated communities are very popular, these villas. I've been to many of them, friends of mine have. American holidays are very popular. Another example of internationalization, American influence. The younger you are, of course, the more likely. Christmas, Valentine's Day are very popular. Even April Fool's Day is becoming more popular. Once they realize that it doesn't really celebrate fools, it doesn't really mean. There's another so-called Neighborhood survey, internal survey, which is very interesting to me. There were 21 questions that had history students from 33 different universities. But on belief systems, almost 73% said individual success. Not, obviously, not surprising to anyone, not striving to realize communism. Over 82% understood that Western visual cultural products directly or indirectly propagate Western political concepts and lifestyles. But over 50% identified with them, and only 17% did not identify with American cultural concepts. This is backed up by other surveys. I have a friend I work with in China, because I edit a translation journal. We just published his long survey, which couldn't be published in China, on 5 elite universities in Beijing, and very detailed questions, long survey, on their far greater support for the American political system than the Chinese political system, particularly separation of powers, because of thinking that's the only way to fight corruption. Harvard University, MBA, these are kind of buzzwords. Now, as Sam said, I work on film, so especially political comedy film, box office. So this is all-time box office results as of January 29th. If you look, you see Avatar. Sorry, it's in Chinese, but because a lot of the titles are Chinese films. But the number one film of all time by far is Avatar, followed by Transformers 3, Kung Fu Panda 2. Everything in color is an American film, a Hollywood film. Kung Fu Panda 2, just to give you an idea what people are watching. 2012, Pirates of the Caribbean 4. Inception, Transformers 2, Harry Potter, Deathly Hallows Part 2, Titanic. I have this as Shirley on San Sebastian because that was a recent film, a low-budget romantic comedy, which had a tremendous box office success, which surprised everybody. I was giving a talk at Beijing University in November last year on film, and that was out in the theaters, and everybody at the film conference was talking about that. Then you have Transformers, Smurfs, Fast and Furious 5, Alice in Wonderland, Battle in Los Angeles, which wasn't very successful here necessarily, but it was big in China, and another Harry Potter film. This is what the box office totals. Something else interesting on film is what we call 投票房, or stealing the box office. So, for example, if you look at that list I just showed you, some of the propaganda films, like this is beginning of the Great Revival, about the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. You buy a ticket to see martial arts films like wuxia, but you actually get counted. On your ticket, it says the propaganda film. So in fact, the box office figures are completely inflated for the propaganda films, and also as much as 40% of the box office is not really accurate because a lot of skimming, underreported. That's another story for another time. Another example of that, if you can barely see this, but this is a ticket again, which said beginning of the Great Revival. In fact, people were going to see Kung Fu Panda 2. So there's been a lot of manipulation in the box office. If you look at the latest figures, what 43% from January to February 25th this year, 43% of the box office was U.S. films. Then another 34% were co-productions with Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China. And Chinese films, the domestic films, domestic films, only made up 17% of the box office. That changes from time to time. So that, at least according to official data, the U.S. maybe makes up Hollywood films as much as maybe 50% at most. But they try to make sure the Chinese films have at least 50% of the box office in any given year. So this last week, Journey to Mysterious Island, Mission Impossible 4 were the top films. I'm going to skip over something. I know I'm running out of time. Box office growth in China is tremendous. That's number 2 in the world, behind North America. Japan is now number 3. I'm going to skip over. Time is running out on me. Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, gave a speech in which he argued that China has to defend its culture against the Western assault. And so this is, again, a contradiction. You want to bring in the Hollywood films because that's what the audience likes, and also theater, you make a lot more money because Hollywood gets a small share, 13 to 17% right now of the box office, which may go up to 25% after Xi Jinping's trip to the United States. In Los Angeles, we signed an agreement which will increase Hollywood's share of the box office for the revenue sharing films, but it's still less than anywhere in the world. So you want to bring in these Hollywood films. At the same time, you're concerned about how that culture that comes out of those films will affect things. Flowers of War, when I spoke in Beijing, I had a lot more to say about the Flowers of War. Has anybody seen that film? I don't know if it's played in Denver. You probably saw it online, right? You downloaded it. Okay. But that's a very interesting case. When I spoke in Beijing, I talked about why it would not succeed, what are the positives and negatives of that Christian Bale film, Zhang Yimou's new film. What was interesting to me is Christian Bale was accused of making a propaganda film when he made that film. So he felt obligated, I think, to call CNN and said, let's go to Linyi County. I want to meet this blind activist lawyer who's under house arrest, Chen Guangcheng. So he went there and ended up being wrapped up. Now this guy has become kind of a famous person. This military guard, the security guard in the military code, this guy, and here's Christian Bale. Because this is one of the fascinating things about China is all of the or the spoofing that goes on the internet. So you have these fake posters from the new Batman movie, where you have this blind activist here, Batman here, and the military guard, the security guard in the coat, towering over everyone. And let the every lie because the activist is blind. That's a fake poster. Another fake poster, The Dark Knight Rises, which is the title of the new film. The legend ends because the security guard is smashing Batman. Then you have the same guard in Times Square. Then you have him with Mao and all the women. Here he is with Kim Jong-il. And then you have posters like Panda Man versus Batman, Christian Bale and National Security. So there's a lot of that kind of what they call spoofing in China. I can say a lot about Kung Fu Panda. China's trying to improve its animation industry. This Lust Question is something I've written articles about, but again, I'm running out of time.
It's okay, you can have time.
A little bit more time. Okay,
Yeah.
Let me talk about Avatar versus Confucius. That was another interesting case of these contradictions. So, Avatar, Confucius was pulled out of theaters. It was supposed to end on January 28th that year, and Avatar was supposed to, Avatar was supposed to end on January 28th, and Confucius was supposed to be the next attraction, the Chow Yun-fat film. But in the 2D theaters, not 3D or IMAX, they pulled out Avatar on January 23rd, 5 days ahead of time, to make way for Confucius. It already had become the biggest hit ever. in China. So you had all these posters. PK is basically one-on-one struggle. You can translate that as play or kill in gaming or penalty kick in soccer, but it's very common in China to use PK. Confucius versus Avatar. As a propaganda film, it was shown in all the high schools. This is actually the official China Daily. This is a response to Confucius by the high school students. This is a funny one. How many of you have seen Confucius? Well, if you're saying Confucius, say one person.
We do.
Well, this is all about it's all about box office. Zhou Xun playing Nanzi, the courtesan, is by far the most interesting character in the film. And she's in there for box office purposes. She's explaining boxing. She's trying to seduce Confucius in the movie, and unsuccessfully. But she's there for the box office. She's explaining to Confucius about the box office. How can we get a better box office? And Confucius has no conception of box office. So that's kind of an interesting. Okay, even in the official press, they said, why do you want Outer to yield to make way for you? So it backfired badly. And then there are all these other things from Taiwan. Li Na case is another interesting one because in the same way with Jeremy Lin, Li Na won the French Open. It was played up on page 1 of People's Daily, a tremendous victory for Chinese sports, for Chinese people. But the main reason Li Na succeeded, aside from her great talent, is that she refused to be part of the Chinese sports system. She left because they were making these demands on her and not wanting her to work privately with her coach. And so she left the Chinese national team, left China, and won, basically, because she did it her own way, the same way Jeremy Lin did. But now she's claimed, obviously, when she's been asked questions, after winning the French Open, they asked her questions about Tiananmen Square in 1989, and she said, I don't want to talk about politics at all. But you can't easily escape. I could say a lot about Rolling Stone's an interesting case. Bob Dylan, these are just things I would talk about in my time. Bob Dylan, here's another example, though, of China trying to be world-class and everything. They're very concerned they have no world-class universities. So they're trying everything they can for example, in the latest ranking of Asian universities, no university in China was among the top 10 in Asia. They're very concerned about things like that. And even within China, people feel that there are no world-class universities by and large. The problem is, one of the problems is, to be a world-class university, you have to have much more academic freedom than takes place in Chinese universities. You can't have it both ways. And so that's an issue. And again, if we talk about China's international image and soft power, all those old things that the government would like to push in the back, whether it's Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, or in this case, Tiananmen Square. When Gaddafi was still trying to stay in power in Libya, he made a speech saying, I'm going to fight to the last drop of my blood, which he did, I guess, threatening strikes. We're going to be just like Tiananmen Square in 1989. So those old images, that old legacy is still there internationally, and you can't completely get away from it. I'm going to stop in a few minutes, but I do work on youth attitudes and behavior. Before the Sichuan earthquake in May 2008, you had all these articles coming out that China's younger generation, so-called Bali Po, post-80s generation, those born from 80 to 89, were basically self-centered. They basically were not community-oriented, didn't want to volunteer for anything, just looking out for themselves. Then you had also the so-called Fanqing, or the angry youth, another image of Chinese youth, the neocon nationalists, according to Evan Oslo's in New Yorker. But after the Sichuan earthquake, you had a completely different reevaluation. They're not spoiled, egotistical, rebellious, but basically they're very concerned about the country. I think all of those things, I did an article a couple years ago for Journal of Asian Studies where I tried to point out how to square that particular circle, that they are incredibly patriotic, including patriotism within China, helping China, as well as being very materialistic. And under different circumstances, will display different behavior. I gave one example of how these things go together. For example, during the Olympic torch relay, because in France, in Paris, when the woman in the wheelchair was carrying the Olympic torch and somebody tried to pull it out of her hands, it was Gigi, I think her name was that right? The girl in the wheelchair in Paris during the Olympic torch relay. Yeah. So there's a call in China to boycott Carrefour, the big superstore like Walmart, the French version, and Carrefour, yeah, a call to boycott that. So I talked to people, and they said, yeah, we have to honor that call to be patriotic, but that begins on May 1st, so we're going to make sure to use up all our discount coupons before May 1st, and then we can honor the boycott. We get everything we need. So you have the materialism, the internationalism, the nationalism, patriotism, all going on at the same time. At the time, I'm also interested in differences between several post-80s and post-90s. Those born between 80 and 89, those born between 90 and 99, and the fight between them on the microblogs. If I have time, I talk about Han, very interesting. I try to bring Han to USC, actually, to speak.
But he's in big trouble.
Well, that's one reason he couldn't come. And this goes back to 1999 and the bombing of the embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. What was interesting, and maybe this will be the last thing I'll say, if you look at after NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and 3 Chinese died, there was a complete reevaluation. The Beijing Youth Daily had every day a different article, a reevaluation of American films, for example, reevaluation of human rights, freedom of the press, national power, globalization, reevaluation of Western civilization, all in a much more negative direction. There were demonstrations, people throwing rocks at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and so on. What was most interesting to me, though, at that time, was before the series of articles began, the day before, there was a piece also, May 12, 1999, in Beijing Youth Daily, saying that the staff members of American, European, multinational corporations, their lives are just going on as before. It's just normal. That's not changing. We still want foreign investment. We still want foreign trade. This picture down at the bottom, basically saying support the government's standpoint and build a strong military to defend the country. It's not. It looks like China's going to launch a missile attack, but it's basically telling the students, trust us, we're going to make China stronger, so this will never happen again. But the point is that even in this very dark time, when there were public demonstrations on the streets, calls for boycotts of McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and everything else, the government was very aware of the importance of foreign trade, foreign investment, and didn't want any of the short-term factors to affect that. And so that was basically the policy, which is a very positive thing, I think. This is when I was in Beijing for the Asian World Cup Finals in 2004. I saw the China-Japan match, and it was almost a riot. It took the Japanese 2 hours to leave the stadium because of a controversial goal. Oh, I should maybe say something about the goodwill tour. It's a game against the People's Liberation Army Bai team. It didn't work out too well. Okay, well let me stop here because I think I've taken an hour almost, and I can answer any questions.
Okay, and please join me thank him first. He did been in China so many times. Every time I met him is in Beijing airport.
I met you at Tokyo airport in January.
Yeah, the January to Tokyo, and the last time was also in Hong Kong. Hong Kong airport, yes. Every time in the airport. So he's in China all the time trying
to go to the same lounge.
trying to steal all the information he should steal.
Wait a second. Who do you work for?
Okay.
So now the floor is open, and please identify yourself to let him know who you are. You will not steal his information.
No, that's,
And try to be brief.
you can give a false name like they're doing way back.
Okay. Okay, Tom.
Thank you. It's a very, very interesting presentation. My name is Tom Dowd. Recently, Sam had a Chinese scholar here from Poland, and he asked a question I hadn't really thought about, and I'd like to run it by you. He said, does China have or want a friend internationally as they move forward? Everything we've seen and we usually hear about China looks internally or sort of bipolar, bilateral relationship between China and somebody else. But I wondered what you thought about China's need or desire for an international friend.
Tom is our business school.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely, they want friends. Unlike, let's say, the Cultural Revolution period, where only Albania and some Marxist-Leninist party representatives were there after they basically withdrew all, except for Egypt, withdrew all their ambassadors during the Cultural Revolution. No, they very much want friends. And their basic message has been that the peaceful rise of China is not threatening to anyone. They're trying, their policies, although it's being called into question now, of non-interference in other countries, is in part because they don't want to take sides. But what that ends up doing, basically, is supporting whoever's in power at any given time, whether it's Assad in Syria, or Gaddafi in Libya, or anywhere else. And they're running into problems now because in the Sudan, for example, North and South Sudan, they're being called on by both sides to mediate the dispute over oil profits and so on. And because China's such a heavy investor and depends so much on oil from there, and they basically want to support both sides. It's not always easy to do. They want to be friends with everyone, in effect. But their closest friend is North Korea, perhaps.
Okay, here.
The thing that struck me, particularly in the early parts of your lecture, was the fact that so many of the criticisms of China that you were talking about could have been about us. I mean, that's troubling.
Which criticisms were you thinking of?
Well, our split politically here, our concerns about the rest of the world, our power vis-a-vis the rest of the world, our increasing inequality in income, our social views. There are a lot of similarities.
Yeah, in fact, I would be much more critical of the U.S. because of Congress, for example, and one of the reasons people are leaving the Senate and not going again to the House, partly because of redistricting issues, but also because it's become so partisan. There's such a desire to get rid of Obama that it doesn't really matter anymore. We're not going to do anything that will give him any support by passing anything that will help him get reelected. So unfortunately, the partisan nature makes, and a lot of people in China who favor the U.S. political system don't necessarily understand all of the problems that exist.
Okay, here.
Hi, Professor Rosen. Thank you for speaking. My name is Michael McNeil, and I wanted to ask you, you just mentioned that China's only formal ally, particularly military ally, is North Korea. It's the only nation with whom China has a mutual defense treaty, and they seem to prop up the North Korean regime. And yet you showed us pictures that illustrate the way aspects of North Korean leadership are parodized with, by Chinese youths or whoever, with the picture of the cop who, or security guy who confronted Christian Bale behind Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. And I wonder, is there a disconnect between popular perceptions in China of the North Korean regime and the government's support of the North Korean regime?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's absolutely the case, I think. In fact, some years ago, the journal Strategy and Management, which is...
In fact, we are going to publish an article, I think this issue, doing internet research on the Chinese public opinions about North Korea. Very active.
very negative. Then they compare with the Chinese government policy. You want to read the article online, it will be a bad book.
Yeah. You can buy the journal, right?
Of course. You want to hear it?
No, that's very much the case. The tremendous criticism, why is China tied to this feudalistic system where you have father, son, son, it's very feudalistic, but there are reasons why the Chinese government favors North Korea for obvious reasons in terms of stability and not having all these refugees crossing the border and the fear of the Americans and the South Koreans being, as in the Korean War, up to the Chinese border. But certainly the popular opinion is very negative toward it. It's very hard to be positive toward North Korea, I think, unless you are looking at some of the things the Chinese government is looking at.
So does that domestic disapproval of the government's policy vis-a-vis North Korea put pressure on it to modify its...
No, on that case, no. There is pressure on certain kinds of issues dealing with Japan, the United States, particularly Japan. And there have been some decisions made about, for example, when there were going to be bullet trains, which were eventually going to be built by the Japanese with a lot of Japanese investment. That was later changed because there's such an outcry. The Japan factor is a special case given the history. But on the North Korean case, no, public opinion does not have any effect.
Or the government will not allow to have a public criticism of North Korea because North Korea would protest the Chinese government right away, whoever talks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, then...
I mean, this is some people, the recent criticisms from the North Korean military, in the military newspapers about South Korea, saying they're going to, again, turn Seoul into an inferno, incineration, and so on, because some people in the South Korean military defaced pictures of Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. Yeah, the Chinese are very careful, and Tragedy Imagine was closed down. And one of the main reasons was this article questioning the North Korean policy.
Okay, over there.
I had a question to get back to the sort of political opinions. I was reading an article in the New Yorker about Chinese political opinions involving the U.S. primary process. And it seemed like a lot of the people they interviewed found it amusing that Mitt Romney was running here because he's rich first and now he's trying to get into office, whereas they felt in China, you get into office, then you magically end up rich. So I wonder if you can give us any further insights on what Chinese public opinion has to say about either our primary and election processes or just the U.S. way of democracy on the whole.
That's a very good question, and again, you have to distinguish a couple of different things. One is what is actually published in the official press, what can get in. Like my friend who did this survey, he's done previous surveys on attitudes toward the United States, attitudes toward Japan, among Chinese university students. And when they have been published, they've left out all of the sensitive kinds of issues. So you have to collect this data from friends who've done the surveys or in so-called internal journals where it's a bit more open to speak about these kinds of things. There is that feeling, certainly, it comes through a lot in the one I showed up here from the Academy of Social Sciences on history students at 33 universities. There were 21 questions, and one asked about the U.S. political system and the separation of powers. There's a lot of support for a separation of power system because of the feeling that corruption, I would interpret it, that corruption cannot be solved so long as power is fused in the Chinese Communist Party. They'll protect their own, basically. But I don't know, how much of a real understanding there is. It's a lot better than it was. Back in the 1980s, for example, when I was going around various Chinese universities to speak, I was surrounded on various campuses by students who said, because student movements had already begun by 85 and 86, students were saying, we don't believe anything the Chinese press says. Is it true that China secretly supports apartheid in South Africa? Is it true that China is selling arms to both Iran and Iraq during the 1980-88 war? We believe everything that's in the VOA says, and we believe everything the BBC says, and we should be skeptical of everybody, not just China. Because the government kept out all information about the West and only published very negative things. So if the Chinese press said the streets of New York were dirty, people thought they must be very clean. It was kind of the opposite. After 1989, after the reforms really began in earnest, after Deng Xiaoping's trip in 1992 to the South, and they began to let in all this Western culture, American films came in for the first time with The Fugitive in 1994. After all that, they found out much more about the West. They realized that the West is not what we thought. They have problems too. By keeping out that information, they in fact lionized or glorified what was going on in the West inaccurately. So now the attitude is more national interest. We know that what the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party is doing is not always good, but the same thing is true of Western countries, and therefore we should support our government. That's become much more the case. But then you have, if you look at the microblogs, you can find any forum you want which will support the views. The Strong Country Forum, the Military Forum, very nationalistic forums, but you have very liberal forums too. This may change as people are now going to be required, supposedly, to register in these microblogs with their real names and can be traced. So we'll see how that develops. Already, Sina.com and some of the main hosts for these microblogs are protesting. They're losing a lot of customers. I think the surveys show that when they've been done without government interference, that there's an admiration for certain aspects of the American political system, for example. And I was in Taiwan with Station. I was there for the Taiwan elections in January. I've been observing elections in Taiwan since 1991 as an observer, and tremendous interest in China on this election, and in some ways wishing we could have something similar in China.
Only difference that Taiwan have to wait until evening to find the result of the election. You will find before the votes. The day before the vote, so that's the difference you can find.
Well, that sounds like fun good news.
Professor Rosen, thank you for being here. Bill Croak, I'm an attorney here in Denver. Your work on the cinema, is that still forthcoming? Is that out?
I have a number of, I have quite a few articles in Chinese actually, some of which have been censored. I did one which had a whole big section. I did one on Hollywood's global strategy and what India, South Korea, and Taiwan have done to combat that, and what China can learn from it for a conference at Funan University in Shanghai. When they published it, the whole Taiwan section was eliminated as too sensitive. In the introduction it says I'm talking about Taiwan, and the conclusion said as I talked about Taiwan, there's no Taiwan. And they changed it to Taiwan district, Taiwan District. But no, I quoted a book that came out in 2010, Art, Politics, and Commerce in Chinese Cinema. And one chapters I did for that one was the international market for Chinese cinema. I did a piece for our Center for Public Diplomacy on how Hollywood films make a much better case for China's soft power than China's own film industry. And I have a piece coming out in Blackwell Handbook of Chinese Cinema. A long piece is coming out in the next month or so maybe on film and society in China. A lot deals with political economy of film, box office of film, that kind of thing.
Okay, with this, I think last two, Peter and you.
I would argue China's greatest international spectacle was the Olympics.
Yes.
And that they pulled it off successfully.
Yes.
And won more medals than ever before. Are they gearing up now for London?
You could be sure they're gearing up for London, but the key, of course, was Beijing, because that's domestic consumption as well. I don't think they'll be as successful in London as they were in the Beijing Olympics, but they will be very successful because what they have done is to target certain events where the competition is not as strong and where they have a chance to win the medals. What they want to do, though, because they want to highlight the really popular events, like track and field, for example. It's very interesting. I've been a consultant on a number of documentaries made by friends on the Beijing Olympics and the Asian Games in Guangzhou. And so I know the struggles over getting the official Olympics film approved. There are two versions, one approved by the Beijing Olympic Committee and one by the International Olympic Committee. somewhat different because certain parts of the original documentary, the Beijing Olympic Committee did not want, doesn't make China look bad, or for other political reasons, probably not best not to say, probably. But one example of that is Liu Xiang, the hurdler, who won at Athens. Everybody knows Liu Xiang, the hurdler. In the Beijing Olympics, he did his best, but he had a foot injury. He came up lame. He had to withdraw. And there are some very poignant scenes of him doing that, leaving the stadium with his head downcast. That had to be eliminated for the official Olympic film for the Chinese version in China because they only wanted positive things. But that's in the official version commissioned by the International Olympic Committee, which shows overseas. So they definitely want, because hurdling, high hurdles, that's a signature event, an important event, and Liu Xiang was a hero in China. So they don't want him to look bad. And they're still going to target those kinds of events in track and field, for example, and swimming.
Okay, last one.
Peter Golis, I'm a historian of traditional China, and so I thank you particularly for helping me to keep up with
Maybe God.
But anyhow, going back to the original question, the title of your talk, Will Real China Stand Up? Very interesting, particularly in this election period in this country. It's the problem with that kind of a question, of course, is would the real America please stand up? And I think you were very enlightening on the point of the variations that one does find in China. But taking that point and combining it with the very important point that you made, the growth of inequality, is there any way of tying that together? In other words, what I'm asking, is there even greater variety in China? Is the variation increasing in part because of the economic variation that is occurring?
No, I think that is very much the case. And the government is very aware of it. When Jiang Zemin was the head, the General Secretary and President of China, that's when the economic development strategies were most prominent, with less concern for inequality issues. Under Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao leadership, there's certainly much more attention paid to that, but you still have that gap between the coastal cities and the interior, not to mention places like Xinjiang and Tibet, where they are pouring a lot of money in to try and solve the problem through economic development. The problem there, of course, has to do with the influx of Han Chinese benefiting more, or even Hui, the Chinese Muslims who are not Uyghurs or Tibetans, benefiting rather than the local people for a variety of cultural reasons. But yeah, I think they're very well aware of the problem. It's very difficult to really solve it because the engine of growth has been in the coastal areas. And you have to keep at least, it used to be said 8%, maybe now 7.5% growth rate just to keep employment high enough to avoid unrest. So if you want to keep the employment high enough, you still have to favor, in many ways, the coastal areas where that development has the infrastructure, the foreign investment, and everything else that's necessary. Trying to get foreigners to invest in less developed areas. But it's not as bad as it was, but I remember many years ago, going back to the early 80s, I think when I was in Guangzhou, about 84, 85, 86, I talked to people at the consulate there, and they said, Guangzhou is doing very well. The people in Guangxi province, we've been invited out there to try and help them get investment, foreign investment. And one of the leaders of Guangxi said, we're facing this real fight with the conservatives in the province who don't want foreign investment. But if we can get foreign investment, we can beat back the conservatives. So if you're an investor and you hear that there's a power struggle going on, some people don't want you there, that's the last place you would invest. Its political risk is too great. So now things are much better because I think everybody wants foreign investment. But that was not the case early on. So the coastal cities had those advantages and they benefited, and that comparative advantage is still there.
Okay. Before we thank him, I want to make a few announcements here. Our next, because this is last week of the
quarter. Oh yeah, back there. For those who are not on our email list, you are interested in our events, please sign up in the back. You can send out your email addresses, so we put you on the email list. You will receive all our events. Our next event will be at the end of the month, on the 30th. We have a speaker from Duke University, Professor Liu Kang. The Chinese audience, I think, are familiar with his name because he's the author of 妖魔化中国背后的作者, the
Demonization
of the China. That's one of the books in the 1990s, very, very popular, the bestseller in China, say how Americans had a conspiracy to demonize China. So it became very, very popular in China. So he is a professor at Duke University, and he's coming to talk about Chinese intellectuals today. And then on April 6th, we have a speaker, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa from Washington, coming to talk about U.S.-African relationship in the context of China's entering Africa. So China, U.S.-African relationship. Then on April 17th, we have speaker Dan Wright. He was with the Secretary of Treasury at that time, Hank Paulson, working on U.S.-China economic dialogue. He was his senior advisor, and now Republican out of office, so he is doing his own consulting job. So he come talk about China-U.S. Relations. And then we have our annual conference. This year is on May 4th and 5th. The topic of this year's conference is Beyond History, Reconciliation and Sources of Conflict between China and its neighbors. So we invite, this conference will be jointly sponsored by Zhejiang University in Hangzhou and also Chahar Institute in Beijing. They will send people from China and most from Beijing and Zhejiang to join us. And also because China's relationship with neighbors, we invite people from Japan, from Korea, from India, from Hong Kong, all over the area to present their views on this relationship. So we will send out announcements and registration. This is our 10th anniversary of the annual conference. I hope we have a big crowd for the conference. Then we have another speaker from Taiwan in May. He just retired from the Taiwanese government. He was the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs policy planning chairman there, working on the foreign policy planning and design. He is now a fellow at a Brookings Institution in Washington. So he will come talk about Taiwan issue. So look for our announcements. Hopefully you will be able to join us for all those events, or at least for our conference. So with that, please join me again to thank Professor Rosen for such wonderful presentation. I think he will be happy to hang around a few more minutes if you have anything you want to talk to him.
Thank you.